As the 1840s began, many factors aligned for the perfect storm that made the famine as destructive as it was. More than a quarter of the entire population was unemployed. Many lived in workhouses that were mandated by the Irish Poor Law of 1838 and funded by local taxpayers, while many others roamed the countryside begging and sleeping in ditches to survive. Almost half of the population lived in tiny, single-roomed, windowless mud cabins and survived on the potatoes that they grew on land for which their landlords charged them a very high rent to use. Almost a half of the population had become dependent almost exclusively on potatoes for their diet. The Irish spirit of rebellion against the British had also begun to rise again, as citizens under the leadership of Daniel O'Connell demanded the repeal of the Act of Union. The movement peaked at the end of 1843 when they staged a large yet unsuccessful rebellion in Dublin, in which O'Connell was arrested and died soon after, leaving Ireland without a strong leader during its darkest hour. In September of 1845, the leaves on potato plants started to wither, turn black, and quickly die, all while emitting a nauseating stench. This spread extremely quickly throughout all of Ireland. Within only a matter of a few days, one infected potato could infect thousands of others. The Irish people began formulating theories of what could have caused such devastation, including that it was a divine punishment for the sins of the people, or that static electricity from the newly introduced locomotive trains was causing it. In reality, it was caused by an airborne fungus called Plethora infestans that had been transported to Ireland from North America. England had strictly followed the laissez-faire economic theory, meaning that they did not get the government involved in economic issues in belief that all problems would eventually be solved for themselves. This carried over into their relief efforts for the Irish. This negligence on Britain's part infuriated the Irish, accentuating the already present anti-British sentiment in the Irish people. However, the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, did attempt to get the Corn Laws repealed, which had subjected any crop being imported into Britain to be tariffed, in an attempt to give Irish lower prices for the other crops to eat. This angered many Britons who'd benefited from this tax, and Prime Minister Peel eventually resigned, leaving Lord John Russell to be his successor, who was a rigid supporter of the strict laissez-faire approach to helping the Irish. Before resigning, however, Peel had attempted to solve the food problem by purchasing 2 huge shipments of Indian maize corn directly from America. Not only did the Irish not like the grain since it didn't fill them up, but it was also hard to digest, lacked vitamin C, which resulted in scurvy, and peasants soon ran out of any money to pay for the grain. By 1846, all shipments were exhausted. All other failed harvests had rebounded the next year, so the Irish assumed that the fall of 1846 would bring about a great potato crop and their problems would be solved. This proved untrue as the fungus returned, ravaging crops and spreading 50 miles per week across the countryside, leaving only enough potatoes to feed the Irish for a month. Additional crop failures happened in 1848 and 1851, prolonging the so-called Great Hunger. Greedy to maintain their economy, the British continued to export many of Ireland's other crops to Britain, resulting in food riots erupting in ports. Instead of sending aid, Britain sent troops to ensure the shipments took place. A starving inhabitant of County Mayo cried, "Would to God the government would send us food instead of soldiers." The British only spent £7 million on relief aid, less than 1/2% of its gross national product. To make matters worse, that winter was one of the coldest and most brutal in Ireland's history. In order to survive, the Irish began pawning off any remaining items they had, scavenging for food in the countryside, and working on public works projects. These projects were failed attempts to employ thousands of Irish to do pointless jobs building roads that led to nowhere, to earn a bit of money so their family didn't starve. Despite these efforts, starvation and associated diseases, including typhus or black fever, devastated the population, killing an estimated 1.5 million people. As William Foster said, the children were like skeletons, their features sharpened with hunger and their limbs wasted, so that little was left but bones, and the happy expression of infancy gone from their faces, left behind the anxious look of premature age. Some men and boys even intentionally committed crimes in order to be sent to prisons in Australia, where they knew they at least would not starve. In another attempt to survive, many Irish immigrated to the United States. Between 1845 and 1855, an estimated 2 million people arrived in America, and thousands more went to England. Unfortunately, the immigration to America was anything but perfect. They traveled on so-called coffin ships containing thousands of Irish, many of whom were sick, causing disease and death on these ships to spread rapidly. If they managed to survive these trips to America, they still lived in destitute and suffered much discrimination, as many Americans viewed them as inferior and held much anti-Irish sentiment towards them. The hundreds of thousands of Irish who immigrated to England did so because food handouts were available freely throughout the country, yet many were still deported back to Ireland. In the fall of 1847, England suffered an economic crash, resulting in the little funding that they had initially been giving Ireland in the form of small soup kitchens to be entirely cut off, as English officials turned inward to deal with their own country's problems. The only remaining relief effort was relief through workhouses, as established in the Poor Laws, but in order to receive help from these workhouses, families were forced to give up any land they owned, thus giving up any dignity they had left. Britain's minimal attempts to aid the Irish, as well as their brutal policies for dealing with the poor, sparked much anti-British sentiment throughout Ireland. Young Ireland, which was a group of young Irish nationalists, was formed in 1848 and attempted to stage uprisings to protest British rule. Despite being unsuccessful in their goals, this group was the precursor to anti-British uprisings that would eventually lead to the Troubles in the 20th century. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, which eventually turned into the IRA, also was established during this time period by young Irelander James Stephens, who had taken exile in America. For the first time in modern history, a country faced a dramatic population decrease in a time in which most countries' populations were growing exponentially. Despite over 1.5 million Irish perishing during this devastation, the movement against the British finally began to take root. The centuries-old agriculture practices were forced to modernize, and emigration shaped America, as now more than 13 million Americans have Irish roots.
See the stone set in your eyes, see the thorn twist in your side. I'll wait.